Welcome to Shaq's house. Shaq's house. That's our Shaq. You're now in Shaq's house. Shaq's house. Shaq. Welcome to Shaq's house.
What's going on, Shaq Houses? How you doing? It's your boy, the one only Shaq House here. Yeah, I've been away for a few weeks now. I know. I had a vacation in Miami during Labor Day weekend. Oh, it was fantastic, man. Beautiful women, drinks, weather. Oh, it was great. But today, I got something else for you right now, too, that I've been thinking about doing for a very long time now. This character is one of my favorites ever since I was a kid, ever since I first got into comic books, right? The character of Deathlok, the Michael Collins version. But in diving deep into his history, from his predecessor to his semi-spin-offs, I just had to do this character, give this character some shine in the video. And yes, it's another segue away from my usual Marvel X-Men mutant stuff. Right, I'm doing a Deathlok this week. It's one of my favorites. So check it out. Michael Collins, Luther Manning, how they're all connected, and how do Terminator 2 and RoboCop also relate. Check it out. The first Deathlok appeared in 1974 as Marvel Comics' response to the $6 Million Man after failing to secure the comic rights for the series, which went to Charlton Comics. But whereas the $6 Million Man was Hollywood handsome and coexisted with his bionics, Marvel's version would be the opposite. Ugly, mean, conflicted, but deadly. Also known as Deathlok the Demolisher, Luther Manning was a soldier whose remaining flesh was in a dead, necrotizing state while the majority of his body was reconstructed using metal and plastic components. The reinforcement to his skeleton and muscles gave him mild superhuman strength, speed, agility, endurance, and reaction time. His artificial left eye provided variable visual modes, including telescopic, microscopic, infrared, and night vision capabilities, as well as advanced computer-guided targeting programs. He was still technically alive, and so required oxygen, food, water, and rest, although not to the same degree as before his cybernetic conversion. Deathlok's onboard computer system contained an advanced scanning suite that included thermal scans, motion, and proximity sensors, as well as a storehouse of data on various subjects. The interactive intelligence ran on an internal modem, providing Deathlok with a voice in his head with intelligence updates, scanning alerts, and probability breakdowns for various possible tactical responses to a given scenario. He carried a helium neon laser pistol and a metallic knife that was magnetized to his cybernetic leg. In later incarnations, Deathlok removed this computer intelligence from his head and adopted a bulkier, more heavily armored cybernetic frame. Now simply calling himself the Demolisher, Luther Manning now had increased levels of strength and durability, and he employed a modular cybernetic arm set, as well as different weapons like laser cannons, combat blades, or a Vulcan cannon. Some fun facts. Luther Manning was a United States Army colonel from the year 1985 of the alternate reality of Earth 7484. He was fatally injured during a military war games exercise and from the explosion of a concussion mine. Now, Manning's superior, Major Simon Riker, salvaged Manning's body for use in what was called Project Alpha Mech, a covert operation whose purpose was to create cybernetic super soldiers. So to that end, Manning's brain, nervous system, and still living tissue were transplanted into a synthetic body in an operation performed by Major Riker's brother, Harlan Riker. Manning awoke from the weeks-long operation in a body that was partially his own and with a mini-computer occupying a portion of his cranium. He was given the code name Deathlok, as in locked in death. At first, he was an unwilling agent of Riker, but he broke free of his control and became a free agent. After his body was rendered inert, the Roxxon Oil Company stole Deathlok's body from S.H.I.E.L.D., placing him in the custody of a Roxxon-employed surgeon, Harlan Riker, ironically the man who in the alternate reality will create the Deathlok cyborg in the first place. Riker gave the cyborg a rigorous biopsy in order to learn from it. And then, in association with other members of Roxxon's Department M for mutagenics, he created a robotic duplicate of Deathlock. This robot was turned over to the Roxxon Oil Company's Nth Command for testing. It was sent to infiltrate and destroy Project Pegasus, the government energy facility for researching superhumans. The Deathlock robot was destroyed before it could carry out its mission, and eventually Riker was able to make Luther Manning functional again, who then returned to his own alternate future reality, searching for a new purpose in his life. But here, in the present-day 616 reality, the Roxxon Oil Company wanted a new Deathlock created with Harlan Riker at the helm. The modern-age 616 Deathlock begins with a man named John Kelly. A highly decorated United States Marine colonel, Kelly served and fought during the Vietnam War and commanded his own Special Forces unit. Patriotic, aggressive, and an action junkie, Colonel Kelly was disappointed when he was honorably discharged from the Marines and returned back to the United States. And upon his return, he, along with many other returning soldiers, were treated with disrespect by American citizens. Eventually, he found work as an NYPD police officer, and he became notorious for his aggressive stance towards criminals while patrolling his beat in the South Bronx. The NYPD Internal Affairs Division did not approve of Kelly's methods and continuously tried to have him terminated from the force. John Kelly was married at the time and with a child, but eventually his wife, Karen, divorced him, believing that Kelly's violent approach would be a danger even unto himself, and she received full custody over their daughter Sarah as a result. As stated earlier, the Luther Manning Deathlock found its way into the hands of the present-day Roxxon Oil Company when they stole it from S.H.I.E.L.D., and they later turned it over to their research subsidiary company, the Brand Corporation. Now, our reality's Harlan Riker was part of a team that successfully researched the Deathlock cyborg and reverse-engineered a purely robotic Deathlock, which was eventually destroyed by the Thing at Project Pegasus. The Brand Corporation was closed when the original Deathlock escaped with the aid of a time-traveling clone of his human portion, and Roxxon reassigned Harlan Riker as head of another subsidiary, the New Jersey-based Cybertech Systems Inc., where he continued research into the Deathlock cyborg and cybernetics. After creating the Warwolf cyborg, which was basically a melding of a wolf's brain with a computer, Riker oversaw the creation of Cybertech's own Deathlock, one that was more advanced than Luther Manning. Approached by Riker, John Kelly readily volunteered to become the prototype for the modern-era Deathlock. So to that end, his body was cybernetically re-engineered and retooled into the framework of the Deathlock cyborg. The Deathlock's cybernetic implants and CPU worked in conjunction with Kelly's brain to store and retrieve data at incalculable levels. Now, Kelly's initial test run as Deathlock consisted of a set of manually loaded mission parameters into the cyborg CPU. The objective of his test run was to quote-unquote terminate 12 targets. So to that end, Deathlock, armed with a paintball gun, was pitted against 12 trained mercenaries with real weapons. The test run was going well until Kelly attempted to deviate from the mission parameters. The onboard CPU interpreted Kelly's actions as an error, and determining that the source of the error was being from the organic software, i.e. Kelly's brain, the computer corrected that error by electrocuting the brain, killing Kelly in the process. And though the test run was relatively successful, a new brain was now needed along with serious upgrades to Deathlock's programming software. Which brings us to Michael Collins. Born and raised in Philadelphia, Michael Collins was a family man who initially worked at Stark Enterprises, but was hired away to become the department head of the Computer Software Systems Unit at Cybertech Systems. He worked there for 5 years, and he believed that he was writing software for state-of-the-art prosthetic limbs, until the Deathlock project changed him forever. Once again, after John Kelly's test run, Cybertech removed his brain from the Deathlock cyborg, as well as the CPU's electrocution capability, and began retooling. When Michael investigated these changes and uncovered the true weapons-based intention of the project, he went to Harlan Riker himself and demanded that the project be shelved. Riker responded by shooting Collins and having his brain transplanted into the Deathlock cyborg. Days later, the Roxxon Oil Company sent Deathlock to the South American Federated Republic of Estrella, where it was ordered to terminate the guerrillas opposing Roxxon's dam construction there. Now, Michael Collins is a pacifist by nature, and the murders woke him, and he briefly overrode the computer using his computer programming skills. However, Collins' mind eventually fully asserted itself and operated as a Deathlock cyborg from that point on. But here are some capabilities of the Deathlock cyborg. Deathlock, while resembling its alternate timeline counterpart and benefiting somewhat from that timeline's technology, is an entirely new weapon system several orders of magnitude more efficient and effective than its predecessor. The most crucial component in its success as the most versatile weapon in history is the new encephalonic reading and writing technology. Encephalonics allow the use of an organic brain to store information that can be accessed by the Deathlock's main computer and operating system. The human brain has a storage capacity which is, at this point, literally incalculable. Deathlock's computer system contains downloaded contents in excess of 17 Cray mainframe computers and can provide detailed information of a wide variety of subjects: historical, technical, trivial, biographical, etc. The onboard CPU is also a tactical computer capable of providing sensory analyses of targets and situations. It can compute and modify the amount of force Deathlock or any weapon he carries applies in order to achieve different results: stun, kill, ventilate, etc. It can also compute battle plans, assessing variables and parameters to conceive of the best possible course of action to survive a situation or achieve a goal. The computer can then automatically guide the body's reflexes, sharpshooting, and any other actions to a situation without Collins consciously exerting any effort. So even though he's against violence, the CPU's targeting software makes even a pacifist like Collins a crack shot. The system's brain is supported by organic human lungs to supply it with oxygen and a simplified organic stomach to process nourishment. Dissolved nutrients are pumped by an artificial heart through an artificial circulatory system in a synthetic blood-like substance that also carries oxygen from the lungs. And for the sake of convenience, most of the original biological head remains intact to allow the use of the natural nasolaryngeal construction for speech. Nanotech assemblers routinely repair minor damage to the organic systems. The unit's artificial left eye is sensitive to a spectrum stretching both above and below visible light. When in active scanning mode, it can also emit and detect variable frequencies, electromagnetic radiation, and even neutrinos. Deathlock's artificial ear is also more efficient than a human ear and has directional capabilities. Both visual and audio input can be further augmented by digital data gathered by both systems. It is routinely digitized and stored in organic memory, where it can be accessed for playback either by the unit or on monitors. Other than the previously mentioned organic systems, the unit is of entirely artificial construction. Deathlock's skeleton is of pure, indestructible adamantium, tooled to mimic the full human range of motion. The muscles and cartilage are composed of an extremely impact-resistant and surprisingly elastic adamantium steel alloy, which also mimics the full human range of motion. The torso cavity contains the organic lungs and stomach, the computer's central processor, and the controlled fusion generator that powers the cyborg and its primary firearms. The Deathlock cyborg can lift or press up to 85 tons under optimal conditions. The strength limitation is due to the stress and elasticity limitations of the muscle alloy, but the Deathlock system can exert more force than its muscles can bear without being deformed or ruptured. For this reason, an inhibitor function in its operating system prevents it, under almost all circumstances, from exerting anywhere near its theoretical 150-ton strength level. Now, Deathlock's primary offensive weapon is the plasma assault rifle that it carries. The weapon fires plasma created by superheating inert gases and is powered by the cyborg's internal fusion reactor. The weapon is limited by power considerations, and the gun's inability to operate unless in direct contact with the fingertip power outlets in the cyborg's right hand. Deathlock also carries a pistol with similar limitations but less firepower. Adjacent to the rifle is a plasma grenade launcher with immense destructive power. In Deathlock, he can interface with virtually any computer system, and by expanding its sensory perceptions into quote-unquote cyberspace, it can communicate with phone and computer systems via computer code. Some fun facts. Michael Collins is a gifted intellect with a master's degree in computer science and a PhD in both prosthetics and neuroscience. An expert computer programmer, he has used his skills to interface with a Deathlock CPU to implement programming safeguards, such as the no-killing parameter that prevents the cyborg from causing any deaths. Now Collins, he's a fiercely moral man and a reluctant hero who was searching for his human body and a way to get back to his family while helping other people along the way. He has a wife, a son, and a daughter whom he has to keep at a distance due to his many enemies. Coming across one of the transport portals of the Beyonders sent him to a new version of Battleworld with similarly trapped costume heroes and villains. After experiments performed on him by the cosmic entity known as the Stranger, Collins can now assume his totally human and organic state, and yet reactivate his internal computer and full bionic enhancements as Deathlock at will. He also now possesses regenerative powers that can repair both his organic and artificial components. Last seen, he was living alone in Brooklyn, and as Deathlock, he occasionally serves as an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now remember, Michael Collins' brain was transplanted into the Deathlock cyborg after John Kelly's brain was destroyed via electrocution. That brain was removed, but what happened to it? Well, why don't you ask Biohazard? Bio who? When Kelly's brain was removed from the cyborg, it was regarded as dead. However, the lead programmer on Deathlock, Billy Hansen, submerged the brain in a nanoactive stasis fluid as a post-mortem experiment. The stasis fluid was filled with billions of nano-sized replicators and assembled robots. Hansen's intention was that he was hoping the fluid could repair the brain and possibly revive John Kelly. He later injected the brain with various other unidentified fluids, but the lack of results convinced Hansen to dispose of it in the garbage, where it began manifesting self-mobilizing and organic assimilation traits. The brain absorbed organic materials from the surrounding garbage dump that it was tossed in, eventually developing prehensile tentacles and a mouth. It then absorbed a stray cat, and finally a human in order to gain bipedal mobility. Kelly's brain, soon renamed Biohazard, could read the DNA and genetically encoded memories of anything it absorbed, causing it to grow not only in size and mass as it assimilated greater amounts of matter, but also increasing its overall intelligence and thinking ability. Biohazard eventually developed self-awareness and began self-identifying as John Kelly from the original memories left in its brain. However, Kelly as Biohazard was still essentially a self-motivating brain, surrounded by layers of non-vital organic tissue which it shaped and manipulated as necessary. The brain was the only vulnerable piece of Biohazard's anatomy, as other portions of Biohazard's mass could now be torn or blasted off, yet would move on their own accord to reintegrate back into the main body. And by absorbing enough organic matter, Biohazard could grow to gigantic size, with superhuman levels of strength. It could manifest claws, spikes, or prehensile tentacles from its body, or collapse into a liquid state to absorb impact, flow underneath a door frame, or pour itself from the top of a building to the street below. Biohazard's preferred method of absorbing organic matter was to create a telescoping mouth to piece an opponent's head and suck out their brain. And anytime it absorbed a brain in this manner, Biohazard would gain full access to that person's memories. However, it was sometimes difficult, especially during Biohazard's earlier stages of development, to separate out and understand a lifetime's experiences in order to get the information he was searching for. So therefore, Biohazard uses power for quasi-reanimation. It could take the DNA engrams of anyone it assimilated and imprint them on portions of its mass, and then separate that mass from its main body. This secondary mass would run the victim's biological profile like a computer program, rewriting the organic matter into a duplicate of the person's body and reactivating their personality and memories inside that body. This way, Biohazard could get the perspective on the memories it was trying to integrate. Although these bioduplicates thought that they were the original person and generally acted like it, they were really just extensions of Biohazard's body and will. And as a result, they would compulsively reveal information to it or carry out pre-programmed actions without consciously understanding why. These duplicates can also be transformed into secondary bodies for Biohazard itself, with all of its regular capabilities. In the example, when Biohazard reanimated Billy Hansen, the scientist who experimented on the brain in the first place, this duplicate of Billy sought out Deathlok to tell him about Biohazard without realizing that he had been programmed to do so by Biohazard himself. Once he found Michael Collins, Billy's programming was completed and he transformed into another Biohazard in order to fight and assimilate Michael Collins' memories. Some fun facts. Biohazard developed bipedal movement, self-awareness, and self-identified as John Kelly from the memories left in its partially repaired brain. But unfortunately, the severe damage originally inflicted to Kelly's brain via electrocution, combined with the consumption of various other brains, and therefore their memories, left Biohazard confused and unsure of its own identity. With the added nanotechnology that was used to repair it, Biohazard was left with an urge to consume anyone that led it closer to regaining John Kelly's full memories. After coming into conflict with Deathlok, S.H.I.E.L.D., and Kelly's wife and daughter, Biohazard was defeated and subsequently destroyed. However, though that John Kelly's brain was destroyed for good, that wasn't the end of him. Biohazard's presence motivated Michael Collins to learn more about his Deathlok predecessor. Before Kelly's brain was electrocuted to death, a digital copy of his personality and memories, up to the point of his brain being destroyed, was stored on file inside the Deathlok cyborg CPU. Biohazard attacked Deathlok for this very reason, because absorbing Deathlok into itself will complete its fractured memories as John Kelly. And while mentally researching information on his predecessor, Collins accidentally activated Kelly's personality as an independent artificial intelligence. So from that point on, Kelly operated within cyberspace along with the CPU, much to Michael Collins' annoyance. And when confronting a group of cyber warriors, Deathlok tried to jack into the cyborg to override its programming. And Kelly, his personality program, used this as an escape route and uploaded himself into the cyber warrior, thus becoming Siege. But what are the cyber warriors? The cyber warriors were an extension of the previous Deathlok project, with a lobotomized brain serving as wetware for a cybernetic body. They typically possess Class 90 superhuman strength, superhuman endurance, reflexes, and tremendous resistance to physical injury. A cyber warrior's body most likely maintains the basic design specifications of a Deathlok, with molecularly molded adamantium bones and adamantium-derived synthetic tissue and muscles. The body is no longer constructed like a normal human's, as it can spin around 180 degrees at the waist. It is also equipped with a pair of pulse cannons built into its forearms. The left cannon's twin barrels can project sustained energy beams or bursts, while the right arm assembly is a collapsible Gatling cylinder capable of firing off a rapid stream of energy projectiles that can penetrate tungsten steel. It is also capable of flight, and can neutralize some forms of sustained energy assaults by absorbing and rerouting that power through its systems. Although it lacks the same fully interactive computer as Deathlok, a cyber warrior's computer system is capable of scanning his environment for targeting and identification, and has different features such as radar, radio transmission interception, and life-sign monitoring. Each cyber warrior was covered in black and red armor and had wires running through their bodies. As Kelly's personality has been encoded into the cyber warrior in programming language, Siege is impervious to mental scans. Also, the cyber warrior's body has a simplified digestive system that can only absorb a liquid nutrient formula. And also, and this is possibly because the organic portions of his body are not his own, or because the brain he inhabits was lobotomized, the Siege version of John Kelly has no tactile sensation and has very limited emotional range. In fact, Kelly has described the way he experiences his pseudo-life as being akin to playing a video game. Some fun facts. John Kelly is one of America's greatest fighting men, but the brain patterns operating Siege are just a computerized, preserved copy of Kelly's personality and memories. But, even in control of a physical body, Siege has no sense of touch. John Kelly was already an aggressive man, and putting him into a powerful, aggressive body that can't feel anything must be all the more maddening. But more than that, I believe the reason Siege can't feel anything has nothing to do with the fact that the Cyber Warrior body is not his own natural body, but rather because the being controlling it is a digital clone of John Kelly's mind. Michael Collins himself theorized that it's merely an artificial intelligence programmed to believe itself to be John Kelly. But in any case, as Siege, he's worked with Daredevil, Nick Fury, the Silver Sable's Wild Pack, and the Initiative during Civil War. Okay folks, here's a bit of an unofficial FAQ about Deathlok, starting with question number 1. Why does the Deathlok cyborg require a human brain to function? Well, the human brain has a normally untapped data storage capacity that exceeds most supercomputers on Earth. And the Deathlok cyborg's cybernetic implants and CPU, they work with the brain to store and retrieve data far better than any normal brain could consciously do so. But the pure storage is a biological factor. Incidentally, a human brain isn't necessary for the Deathlok tech, as a purely robotic Deathlok was created in the past without an organic brain, but it wasn't nearly as effective. Number 2. When Deathlok is in cyberspace, is cyberspace an astral plane? No, and here's the difference. The astral plane is a dimension linking the minds of living beings, whereas cyberspace is a representational analog of ones and zeros being transmitted electronically. Although there are similarities in how characters use them, the astral plane actually exists in a dimensional space, whereas cyberspace does not. Cyberspace is just an interpretation of the human mind of something that has no real landscape or features. The astral plane has landscape and features, but they're at the influence of the psychic minds that manifest there. Number 3. How did Cybertech intend for the present-day Deathlok to be controlled? Well, in Marvel Comics Presents number 62, they were really just beta testing in the field. With John Kelly, the CPU had too much control over the mission parameters when they could just electrocute the organic brain just for getting out of line. Cybertech removed that feature, but that ultimately shifted control too far in the other direction, allowing Michael Collins to subvert the mission parameters uncontested. Cybertech also did not anticipate Collins being able to access cyberspace or use his own computer programming skills to unlock his CPU's control sequences either. Number 4. Is the mind inside the transplanted brain supposed to be conscious? Well, when Luther Manning was transformed into the first Deathlok, his creators, they did not anticipate that Manning's mind was or would be conscious. Similarly, in the present, Cybertech had no idea that Michael Collins was or would be conscious in that Deathlok cyborg. Now, originally, they chose John Kelly, expecting that a military-trained mind like John Kelly's will work better in conjunction with a tactical computer. But the programming did not account for a conflict between the brain and the computer, so Kelly's brain was subsequently electrocuted. Left scrambling for a replacement, they swiped Michael Collins' brain and loaded it into the cyborg to support the CPU's processing power. The programming was revised to respond to external command cues. If you recall, previously John Kelly and the Luther Manning cyborg during his first assignment manually loaded their mission parameters into the cyborg's circuits. Attempting to deviate from that preset program is what got John Kelly killed. For Collins' first mission as Deathlok, the cyborg responded to Riker's radio-transmitted voice commands directing his programming instead of a loading disk. This allowed Cybertech to change or reinforce the parameters on the fly and prevented any internal conflict between the brain and the CPU from affecting Deathlok's operating. What they didn't anticipate was Collins to be a factor because A, he was just a transplanted brain instead of the body's original like Kelly, and B, Deathlok was now only supposed to respond to external command input instead of internal input. So they were surprised that Collins still existed, and they were definitely surprised that he could manipulate the cyborg. Overall, Cybertech Systems, they had no idea what they were doing, which is partly why the subsidiary was eventually dismantled. The team was on a deadline, rushing to meet the expectations of Roxxon CEOs. They were rewriting code in the span of a day and then testing whether the new operating system could work in battlefield conditions. Yeah, the entire Cybertech program was run in a very sloppy manner, as they didn't have either the time or the inclination to consider the implications of what it is that they were doing. Number 5. How many Deathlocks have there been, starting with the original character? The original Deathlock the Demolisher was Luther Manning, who was turned into a cyborg in his timeline where America had fell apart into a dystopia. He had adventures in the future and later in the present due to various time travel incidents. There were multiple versions of this Deathlock, including a fully organic clone and a fully robotic duplicate. Later in his own chronology, Luther Manning became known as simply the Demolisher. And in a very Terminator 2-like sequence of events, technology from that Deathlock cyborg found its way into the hands of the present-day Roxxon Oil Company. They created the first robotic duplicate and later advanced the technology through the subsidiary of Cybertech to create a new cyborg Deathlock years earlier than they should have. That initial Deathlock was John Kelly, an American soldier whose brain was electrocuted to death on his first mission due to a programming flaw in the Deathlock computer. His unwitting replacement was a computer programmer named Michael Collins, who starred in the 1990s Deathlock series and later the Beyond Limited series. A totally unrelated Deathlock was Jack Truman from the M-Tech line, who spun out of Cable's book. A S.H.I.E.L.D. agent transplanted into a LOK unit, that is, Logarithmic Organic Kinetics, he had a brief career as Deathlock before switching bodies with a rival named Larry Young in the final issue of his own series. But Truman, Young, and the Locke versions of Deathlock, they have not appeared since. But since then, and around 1999 really, Deathlock's continuity pretty much collapsed. Deathlocks have appeared right and left without any real regard for each other or past appearances of Deathlock. And currently, Deathlock appears to be a generic term for cyborg zombie soldiers. Those Deathlocks, they've appeared in Black Panther, Dark Reign, New Avengers, Wolverine Weapon X, etc. There was also a Deathlock the Demolisher series in 2011, which was really an Ultimate-style update on the Luther Manning version. The Wolverine Weapon X Deathlock were from a near-future program to create time-traveling robot assassins who would go back in time and eliminate resistance leaders and other important figures opposing the future's powers that be. Sounds just like Terminator, doesn't it? Here's some thoughts. Despite his seeming end, John Kelly would continue to live on as something of a genuine trinity. His body is the Deathlock cyborg, which after the test run was later piloted by the transplanted brain of Michael Collins. His electrocuted brain mutated into the grotesque biped called Biohazard, and his digitally preserved soul inhabits a cyber warrior known as Siege. Yet John Kelly is like a walking version of the Greek philosophical question of the Theseus paradox, based on the ship of Theseus. That is an object which has had some or all of its parts replaced fundamentally the same object? Kelly's brain was removed from the cyborg and replaced with that of Michael Collins' brain, which means Collins' brain occupying and controlling John Kelly's modified cyborg body. And incidentally, Deathlock's organic portions were maintained by nanotech machines which operated through nutrients and instructions received from reading the DNA cells of the brain in the cyborg. So as a result, the organic portion of Deathlock's face began to resemble Michael Collins instead of John Kelly's, as the nanotechs were now beginning to take instructions from the cells in Michael's brain. So in essence, Michael Collins' brain and DNA began to overwrite what was once John Kelly's body. And though Michael Collins never found his original body, it's now a moot point, and the fact that Collins can now shift from his human form to his Deathlock form at will lends further credence to John Kelly's body now being something and someone else's entirely. Now, I've been a fan of Deathlock ever since I was 9 years old, and even though I was pretty much hooked on X-Men, Michael Collins became a character that I connected with and felt represented the black middle class without resorting to stereotype. Now also, the Luther Manning character predates RoboCop by at least a decade, and the two Deathlocks who appeared in 1990, both Kelly and Collins, they predated Terminator 2 Judgment Day. Here's how the character relates to the film. Here are the parallels. RoboCop had a law enforcement officer whose body was destroyed in combat and then rebuilt into a cyborg with next to no recollection or attachment to his previous life. Now, as for Terminator 2, that involved an African-American family man / computer scientist who was reverse engineering future technology in the present for what he hoped would be a better future. But then he gets his illusion shattered with the fact that his work would lead to a homicidal AI, killer human cyborgs, and nuclear destruction. Now, the respective creators of the Deathlocks, Doug Moench and Dwayne McDuffie, may he rest in peace, they were ahead of their time in creating concepts that would eventually be heavily bitten by Hollywood, but nonetheless translated into jaw-dropping, fantastic action cinema that even today stands the test of time. Now, Moench and McDuffie had different characterizations of Deathlock. The former being a tortured man inside of a machine that he desperately wished to destroy, while the latter two are A, a white patriotic action junkie, and B, an African-American pacifist forced to reevaluate his stance on violence after learning that his work is being used for war purposes. Now, McDuffie, being a middle-class educated black man notoriously opposed to racial stereotypes in his work, somewhat used his version of Deathlock, especially Collins, as somewhat of a voice for his perspective and experience in the African-American middle class, kind of like The Cosby Show. Now, the 90s Deathlock would never have existed if not for Luther Manning. That is, if he did not arrive from the future and been examined by S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Roxxon Oil Company. And what's more is that the Michael Collins Deathlock would not exist had John Kelly never volunteered to become the second Deathlock prior to Collins unwittingly becoming so himself. But now, Michael Collins, he owns the Deathlock role. And considering all the Deathlocks that there have been, John Kelly, Luther Manning, Michael Collins, Henry Hayes, Jack Truman, and the MCU counterpart from the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Deathlock is at this point a legacy character, kind of like the guise of Eric the Red from the X-Men. Alright, Shackhousers, that's what I got for you this week. Tune in next week, I will be back, and I'll be back on my X-Men stuff. It's going to be an eyeful what I'll be doing then. And by eyeful, no, I do not mean my favorite character of all, Cyclops. But until then, you have a good week, folks. Later!
Mansion, apartment.
Shack house. Yes!
Yeah.